My son brought his new girlfriend to dinner. She seemed perfect, maybe a little too perfect, but something felt terribly off. Under the table, my son surprisingly squeezed my hand 4 times. It was our old signal we had used for years since he was a little boy, a silent code only we understood. It meant one thing. Dad, get me out of here. Before I could even ask what was wrong, the real nightmare began, and I realized the woman sitting across from my dining table was not his girlfriend. She was his captor. If you are just tuning into this story, please take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is something I never imagined could happen right under my own roof. If you are connecting with my story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country is listening to me. I was cutting a piece of medium rare steak in the custom kitchen I had built with my own money. I had spent $200,000 upgrading this house for my son Derek. He is 38 years old now, a brilliant software engineer, but tonight he looked like a ghost. He sat across from me, staring blankly at his plate. The expensive overhead lights cast heavy dark shadows under his eyes. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and a cold sweat was soaking right through his expensive button-down shirt. Sitting next to him was Valerie. She was the new girlfriend. Valerie was perfectly polished. Her hair was flawlessly styled. Her nails were a pristine neutral tone, and her smile never seemed to leave her face. She was chatty, pouring red wine, complimenting the marble countertops, laughing at her own jokes. But Derek was silent. He had barely touched his food. He just kept blinking slowly, as if fighting to stay awake. I am 75 years old. I spent 30 years running a cybersecurity firm in Seattle, Washington. I made my living sniffing out threats, recognizing when a complex system was compromised by malicious outsiders. My gut was screaming that the man sitting in front of me, my own flesh and blood, was heavily compromised. I leaned forward to ask Derek if he was feeling all right, if maybe he had caught a bug. Before the words could leave my mouth, I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my knee under the heavy oak dining table. It was Derek. His hand found mine and his fingers wrapped tightly around my knuckles. He squeezed my hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 rapid, desperate squeezes. My blood ran completely cold. When Derek was 10 years old, he had a baseball coach who used to bully the kids in the locker room. We came up with a silent signal back then. 4 squeezes meant, "Dad, I am in severe trouble. Get me out of here right now." He had not used that signal in 28 years. Not once. I looked at his face. He did not turn to me. He just kept staring dead ahead, his jaw locked so tight the muscles in his neck were twitching. I opened my mouth to demand to know what was going on, to tell Valerie to leave my house immediately. But then Derek started to tremble. It started in his shoulders, a violent shaking that quickly took over his whole body. The heavy silver fork slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the porcelain plate. He slumped forward, his eyes rolling back slightly as a low, guttural groan escaped his pale lips. He was having a seizure right in front of my eyes. I jumped up from my chair so fast it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. I reached for my son, my heart pounding violently in my chest. But Valerie was faster. She did not panic. She did not scream for help. Her face remained completely and entirely calm, which terrified me more than anything else in that room. She smoothly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a thick blue liquid. She pried Derek's mouth open with practiced efficiency and squeezed several drops of the strange liquid under his tongue. I grabbed her wrist and demanded to know what she was giving him. Valerie looked up at me, her eyes welling with perfect, calculated tears. She said, "Oh, Victor, I am so sorry you had to see this. Derek has been working himself to absolute exhaustion at the software company. His doctor prescribed this heavy sedative for his severe panic attacks. He just needs to rest in his own bed." Her voice was smooth like honey, but her eyes were cold and utterly dead. She quickly grabbed Derek by his shoulders, hauling him to his feet with surprising, unnatural strength for a woman her size. She draped his limp arm over her neck. I stepped in front of her, telling her I was calling an ambulance immediately, that we needed real paramedics. Valerie stepped around me, her tone suddenly turning sharp, cold, and authoritative. She told me an ambulance would only ruin his career if this got out to his tech investors. She said she had already called a private car and that she was his legally appointed medical proxy. Before I could even process the words medical proxy, the front door opened and a large driver in a black suit stepped inside, helping Valerie carry my semi-conscious son out into the cold Seattle night. I tried to follow them. I tried to push my way into the back seat of the car, but the massive driver placed a heavy hand on my chest and violently shoved me back onto the porch. The car doors slammed shut, and the black SUV sped away down the dark street, leaving me standing alone in the freezing wind, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked back inside the house. The silence in the dining room was deafening. My hands were visibly shaking as I slowly picked up my overturned chair. I walked over to Derek's empty seat to clear his plate, trying to make sense of the madness that had just unfolded. That was when I saw his linen napkin. It was crumpled next to his half-eaten piece of steak. I picked it up, my breath catching in my throat. Smeared in dark brown steak sauce pressed so deeply into the fabric that the sharp fork tines had torn the expensive white linen, was a single desperate word. Help. I stared at the napkin for what felt like an eternity. The letters carved into the white linen were messy and frantic, but the message was undeniably clear. My son was begging for his life. I did not waste time screaming or throwing things. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when dealing with a hostage situation, and my 30 years in the corporate cybersecurity industry taught me that calculated action was the only way to survive. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and walked out into the freezing night. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I started my car. The streets of Seattle were completely empty, shrouded in a thick fog that swallowed the headlights. I drove directly toward Mercer Island, the exclusive waterfront community where Derek lived. I had helped him pick out that beautiful house, a modern property surrounded by tall pine trees and a heavy iron security gate. My mind raced with terrifying questions. Who was Valerie really? How had she infiltrated his life so deeply and quickly? She moved with the cold authority of someone who had planned this for years. The blue liquid she forced into his mouth was not normal panic medication. It acted too fast. I pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. I needed to get my son out. When I pulled up to the long driveway of Derek's estate, the fog was rolling thickly off the dark lake. I parked near the massive iron gates and stepped into the biting cold. I walked up to the digital keypad mounted on the stone pillar and punched in the family code. A red light flashed, followed by a harsh buzzing sound. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the numbers slowly. Access denied. She had locked me out of my own son's property. Before I could process this betrayal, bright tactical flashlights blinded me from the other side. 2 massive men wearing black tactical gear and bulletproof vests stepped out from the deep shadows. They were expensive private security, the kind that asked no questions. One guard rested his hand casually on his holstered sidearm. He stepped close to the iron bars, shining the blinding beam directly into my eyes. He told me in a threatening voice to step away and return to my vehicle immediately. I stood my ground, telling him my son lived in that house and I had every right to see him. The guard did not flinch. He repeated his order, his tone growing colder, warning me that I was trespassing on private property, and he would use physical force to remove me. Before the confrontation could escalate into violence, the heavy oak front door of the main house opened. A small figure walked down the paved driveway toward the gate, wrapped tightly in a cashmere shawl. It was Valerie. She approached the iron bars, her face illuminated by the harsh security lights. The theatrical performance she put on was absolutely brilliant. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She looked at me with profound sadness and told the aggressive guards to lower their flashlights. She leaned close to the cold bars and whispered my name, telling me how heartbroken she was that things had to be this way. I demanded that she open the gate immediately. Valerie shook her head slowly, letting out a tragic sigh. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slipping it through the narrow gap between the bars. I unfolded it under the dim street lamp. It was a formal legal document officially stamped and notarized. A medical power of attorney. Valerie looked at me with fake, tearful eyes and delivered her perfectly rehearsed lie. She claimed Derek had been struggling in secret, that the immense pressure of his software company had broken his mind. She told me a private psychiatrist had diagnosed my son with early-onset schizophrenia 2 weeks ago. She said he was a severe danger to himself, and he had voluntarily signed this document, giving her complete medical and legal control. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was legally barred from seeing him. I looked from the official document to the armed guards standing behind the gate. A younger man might have tried to fight, letting blind anger dictate his actions. But I knew exactly how this malicious trap worked. If I caused a scene, they would call the police, have me arrested for trespassing, and use the report as proof that I was an unstable father. I refused to give them that satisfaction. I folded the paper, placed it in my coat pocket, and turned my back on Valerie without saying a word. I walked to my car and drove away, slowly, making sure the guards saw me leave calmly. I drove for exactly 2 miles before pulling into an empty grocery store parking lot. I turned off the engine and switched on the interior dome light. The absolute unbroken silence of the cold car felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. I slowly pulled the folded document from my dark coat pocket and carefully smoothed it out on the passenger seat. I ignored the dense, confusing legal jargon and looked directly at the very bottom of the final printed page. There it was, my son's signature. I had seen Derek write his name thousands of times on birthday cards and business contracts. The signature on this paper spelled his name, but it was not his writing. The pen strokes were violently jagged, pressed so incredibly hard into the paper that it almost tore through the thick page. The letters dragged downward, shivering with an unmistakable, terrifying tremor. It was the handwriting of a man desperately fighting for consciousness, whose motor skills were suppressed by heavy narcotics. Derek had not signed his life away willingly. He had been heavily drugged, coerced, and forced to hold a pen while toxic chemicals destroyed his mind. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my dark living room watching the sun slowly rise over the Seattle skyline, clutching the forged legal document in my hand. At exactly 7 in the morning, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the city. I bypassed the receptionist, ignoring her protests, and walked straight into the corner office of Mitchell Gallagher. Mitchell was my former legal counsel from my days as a cybersecurity chief executive officer. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who had helped me dismantle hostile corporate takeovers with cold surgical precision. He looked up from his mahogany desk, surprised to see me standing there without an appointment. I did not offer a polite greeting. I threw the crumpled medical power of attorney directly onto the center of his desk. I told him my son had been taken hostage, chemically incapacitated, and legally trapped by the woman whose name was printed on that page. Mitchell did not ask me if I was overreacting. He knew me too well for that. He picked up the document, adjusted his silver reading glasses, and began to scan the legal jargon. His eyes immediately locked onto the signature of the physician who had authorized the psychiatric hold. He muttered the name under his breath. Dr. Aris Thorne. I asked him if he knew the man. Mitchell shook his head slowly, his fingers already flying across his computer keyboard, tapping into legal databases that the general public could never access. Mitchell told me to sit down while his system cross-referenced the medical license number. The office was dead silent, except for the rapid clicking of the keyboard. After a few agonizing minutes, a series of files populated on his large monitor. Mitchell leaned in, his expression darkening with every line he read. He explained that Dr. Eris Thorne was not a typical neighborhood psychiatrist. Thorne operated a highly exclusive, extremely discreet rehabilitation clinic hidden deep in the wooded hills outside the city. It was the kind of luxury facility where wealthy politicians and disgraced tech billionaires went to quietly disappear when they had embarrassing addiction problems. The clinic charged exorbitant fees for total privacy, meaning there was zero outside oversight. They existed behind a wall of strict agreements and heavily guarded gates. But Mitchell was a corporate lawyer who specialized in finding the cracks in impenetrable walls. He dug deeper, bypassing the polished public relations articles, searching for sealed court records and dismissed civil complaints. He found a buried lawsuit from 4 years ago. A former patient and his family had tried to sue Dr. Thorne, claiming their father had been held against his will and subjected to forced chemical restraints to keep him docile while his estate was aggressively restructured. The lawsuit alleged that Thorne used a proprietary cocktail of heavy sedatives and synthetic neurotoxins to simulate severe dementia in patients who were otherwise entirely lucid. The case had been quietly settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, and the records were locked away behind ironclad confidentiality clauses. Mitchell looked at me, his sharp eyes filled with genuine concern. He said Thorne was running a sophisticated medical extortion ring masked as a luxury healthcare provider. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The blue liquid Valerie had dropped into the mouth of my son was part of the chemical arsenal. I told Mitchell to run a background check on Valerie. I gave him her full name, the one she had used to introduce herself at my dinner table. Mitchell typed it in, cross-referencing her details with the clinic employee records. The result appeared on the screen almost instantly, and it confirmed my absolute worst fears. Valerie was not a software sales executive. She was not a sweet, loving girlfriend who had just moved to the city. She was a registered nurse. More specifically, she used to be the head psychiatric nurse at the hidden rehabilitation facility. She was the one who personally administered those forced chemical restraints in the lawsuit. She was a professional handler, trained to medically hijack a human being without leaving a single trace of physical trauma. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a highly coordinated professional medical hijacking orchestrated by experts who knew exactly how to weaponize the legal system against a vulnerable target. Valerie had been planted in the life of my son for one specific purpose. She was there to strip away his bodily autonomy and hand his entire life over to whoever was paying her exorbitant fee. I slowly stood up from the black leather chair, my two heavy fists clenched very tight. I angrily told Mitchell we needed to go to the police immediately and file kidnapping charges. Mitchell raised his hand, warning me that going to the authorities without absolute proof would trigger Valerie to move my helpless boy to an undisclosed medical facility where we would never find him. He said we needed financial leverage to fight this battle in civil court first. I told him money was absolutely not an issue. I had a massive fortune sitting in my private bank accounts ready to crush them. But right as those words left my mouth, a sharp vibration echoed through the quiet office. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I slowly pulled it out and stared directly at the bright, glowing screen. It was an urgent automated notification from Chase Bank. My heart completely stopped. The message stated that my entire personal trust account holding over $40 million in liquid assets had just been completely frozen. I stared at the screen in disbelief, reading the automated justification below the balance. The funds were locked due to a pending legal inquiry regarding the mental competence of the account holder. They were not just taking my son. They were already coming for me, and I was entirely out of time to act. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as the banking notification burned itself into my retina. They had frozen $40 million in a matter of hours. This was not a simple scam. This was a highly coordinated siege on my entire existence. Mitchell Gallagher watched my face drain of color from across his mahogany desk. He asked me what had just happened. I did not explain the details. I simply told him, They had locked my trust account and were moving to declare me mentally incompetent. Mitchell stood up immediately, grabbing his jacket, but I raised my hand to stop him. I told him to stay in the office and prepare every single legal injunction he could draft to stall the conservatorship hearing. The legal battlefield belonged to him, but the digital battlefield belonged to me. I walked out of the corporate law firm and stepped into the cold morning of downtown Seattle. Stripped of my immediate financial resources, I could no longer rely on expensive private investigators or formal legal requests. I had to revert to the tactics I used before my company became a sanitized corporate entity. I needed a ghost. I walked 3 blocks to a cheap electronics store and bought a prepaid burner phone with the loose cash I had in my wallet. Sitting in the driver's seat of my car, I dialed a number I had committed to memory over a decade ago. It belonged to a former black hat hacker named Leon. Years ago, Leon had tried to breach the mainframe of my cybersecurity firm. I caught him, but instead of handing him over to federal authorities to rot in a federal prison, I hired him. I gave him a second chance, and he owed me a debt that could never be repaid with money. He answered on the second ring. His voice was guarded, but the moment I identified myself, his tone shifted to absolute loyalty. I told him I needed an immediate favor. I explained that my son was being held hostage in his own home behind a wall of private security and fake medical documents. I did not want a warrant, and I did not want to wait for the police to navigate a labyrinth of red tape. I told Leon I needed total access to the smart home security network at the Mercer Island estate. Every camera, every microphone, every digital footprint inside that house. Leon did not ask questions about the legality of the request. He simply asked for the IP address and the MAC address of the primary router, which I had saved in my own phone. I drove to a quiet industrial park on the outskirts of the city, parked my car behind an abandoned warehouse, and opened my encrypted laptop. For 30 agonizing minutes, the screen remained black save for a few lines of code scrolling past. Then the screen flickered, and a mosaic of high-definition video feeds flooded my monitor. Leon had successfully bypassed the firewalls and cracked the encryption. I was inside the house. I stared at the live surveillance footage from the security cameras Derek had installed for his own safety. I scanned the living room, the kitchen, the hallways. The house was immaculately clean, almost completely sterile, but it appeared completely empty. There was no sign of the loving domestic life Valerie had described just hours ago. No breakfast being made, no comforting fires in the hearth. It felt like a staged museum exhibit. I instructed Leon to pull up the feed from the master bedroom. It was empty. The bed was perfectly made. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest, terrified that Valerie had already relocated my son to an undisclosed clinic. I told Leon to check the guest bedroom located at the far end of the second-floor corridor. The camera feed buffered for a painful second before snapping into crystal-clear resolution. What I saw on that screen made my breath stop completely. My son was not resting peacefully. Derek was lying flat on his back on a bare mattress without any sheets or blankets. His wrists and ankles were tightly secured to the heavy wooden bed frame with thick leather restraints. He was staring blankly at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. The door to the guest bedroom pushed open, and Valerie walked in. The polished, weeping girlfriend from the front gate was completely gone. She moved with the cold, calculated efficiency of a prison warden. She was not carrying a tray of warm food or a glass of fresh water. She was carrying a plastic cup filled with pills and a stainless steel medical clamp. She approached the bed, grabbed Derek by the jaw, and forcefully pried his mouth open. Derek tried to turn his head away, a weak, desperate act of defiance, but she clamped her hand down hard over his nose, forcing him to gasp for air. The moment he opened his mouth, she shoved the handful of pills down his throat and held his jaw shut until he swallowed. I watched my son gag and choke, completely helpless against his captor. Then Valerie pulled a sleek smartphone from her pocket and answered an incoming call. Leon immediately isolated the audio feed from the room camera, filtering out the background noise so I could hear her voice perfectly. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed through the small speakers of my laptop. She paced around the foot of the bed, looking down at my son with absolute disgust. She spoke into the phone with casual cruelty. She said the kid is completely compliant now. I leaned closer to the screen, desperately waiting to hear exactly who was giving these orders. Valerie paused, quietly listening. Then she spoke again. Tell Todd that the corporate shares will finally be his by Friday. Todd is the brilliant tech startup co-founder of my beloved son. Hearing his name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They had built their software company together from the ground up in a tiny, unheated garage just 5 years ago. Todd was the charismatic salesman, the one who charmed the venture capitalists and hosted the extravagant launch parties. Derek was the quiet genius, the architect who wrote the underlying code that made their entire system functional. I had always thought Todd was a bit too ambitious, a little too slick in his designer suits, but I never imagined he was capable of orchestrating something this utterly demonic. I sat in the driver's seat of my cold car, the glow of the laptop illuminating the condensation on my windshield, and forced my mind to analyze the situation logically. Why would Todd go to such extreme criminal lengths to completely incapacitate his own business partner? The answer was always money. It had to be a staggering amount of money, something so massive it could completely shatter a man's moral compass. I picked up my burner phone and immediately called Mitchell back at the law firm. I told him to stop looking into the medical records and start digging into the recent financial negotiations of the software company. I needed to know what Derek and Todd were working on right before Derek was suddenly diagnosed with this fake mental illness. Mitchell put me on a brief hold, the silence stretching out like a tight wire. When he finally came back on the line, his voice was tight with disbelief. He told me that just 3 weeks ago, their startup had completed the final testing phase of a revolutionary artificial intelligence algorithm. It was a predictive modeling system originally designed to map complex logistical supply chains. But the technology was far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Mitchell discovered a highly classified proposal buried in the corporate emails. The United States Department of Defense had recognized the incredible potential of this algorithm. They realized that if the system could perfectly predict global supply chain disruptions, it could also be modified to predict and map the tactical movements of enemy troops in real time. The Department of Defense had offered to acquire the exclusive rights to the algorithm for a staggering $150 million. It all started to make perfect, sickening sense. Derek had a strict moral code. He had built that algorithm to help people to streamline the delivery of essential resources across the globe. When the military contractors came knocking with their blank checks and promises of defense applications, Derek absolutely refused to sell. He knew the technology could be easily weaponized, turned into an instrument of war, and he held 51% of the voting shares in the company. As long as Derek was in his right mind, the sale would never, ever go through. Todd, on the other hand, was staring at a payout of $75 million. He saw a lifetime of unimaginable wealth slipping through his fingers because of the ethical boundaries of his partner. Greed is a terrifying poison. It rots a man from the inside out, eating away at his conscience until he is capable of justifying absolute atrocities. Todd could not outvote Derek, and he could not force him to sign the contract. So he decided to completely erase Derek from the equation. Todd had sought out Valerie, venturing into the dark, unregulated corners of the black market medical industry. He hired a professional fixer who specialized in making inconvenient people quietly disappear behind closed psychiatric doors. Valerie was paid to drug my son, break his mind, and seize legal control of his medical and financial decisions through the forged power of attorney. Once she had full authority, she could legally sign the Department of Defense contract on behalf of Derek, transferring the shares and securing the massive payout for Todd. But Todd was a cunning adversary. He knew that I was not a foolish old man. He knew my background in corporate security, and he knew I possessed the immense financial resources to immediately hire the best legal team in the country to challenge the sudden medical proxy. He knew that if I had access to my $40 million trust fund, I would obliterate Valerie in court before Friday. That was exactly why my bank accounts were frozen. I closed my eyes as the terrifying scope of Todd's master plan finally locked into place. The automated notification from the bank mentioned a pending legal inquiry regarding my mental competence. Todd had not just filed fake medical reports against my son. He had weaponized the legal system against me as well. He likely used the same corrupt Dr. Aris Thorne to file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services claiming that I was suffering from severe sudden onset dementia and paranoid delusions. By legally questioning my sanity, they triggered an automatic freeze on all my financial assets until a judge could review the case. They had successfully severed my access to my money, leaving me completely powerless to intervene. But the horror did not stop there. I stared at the laptop screen, watching Valerie gently stroke the hair of my captive, drugged son, and a chilling realization washed over me. Todd was not just trying to stall me. The conservatorship hearing for my frozen accounts was not merely a temporary measure to keep me busy while he finalized the sale of the company. If the judge ruled that I was genuinely incompetent to manage my own affairs, I would become a ward of the state. Todd was positioning himself to be the sole benefactor and guardian of our entire family estate. He was plotting to establish permanent legal conservatorship over me. He intended to lock both a father and his son in psychiatric wards for the rest of our natural lives, burying us alive in heavily medicated silence while he freely spent every single dollar of our family fortune. If they wanted me to be a senile, defenseless old man, I decided I would give them a masterclass in dementia. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. My previous fear completely evaporated, replaced by a cold fury. Todd thought he had checkmated me by freezing my assets and questioning my sanity. He assumed I would panic, hire cheap lawyers, and fight a desperate battle in family court. He severely underestimated the lengths a father will go to save his only child. Fighting them from the outside would be a slow legal process, and Derek did not have time. I needed to get inside their system. I needed to infiltrate the medical network they were using. I needed to walk directly into their trap. I drove away from the warehouse and headed straight to my secondary garage. Inside was my absolute pride and joy. It was a pristine vintage Porsche. I had spent countless weekends rebuilding its engine. It was a beautiful machine, but today it was going to be a weapon. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out. I drove toward the commercial district where Todd had his headquarters. The streets were lined with expensive glass buildings, manicured trees, and heavy brick mailboxes. I circled the block twice, waiting for the perfect moment. I needed witnesses without injuring bystanders. I waited until the sidewalk was mostly clear, and office workers stood near the large lobby windows. I gripped the smooth wooden steering wheel, braced myself against the seat, and deliberately jerked the car to the right. The heavy vintage car jumped the curb with a violent crunch. I slammed my foot on the brake just enough to reduce the speed, allowing the Porsche to plow directly into a massive brick mailbox, standing right outside the building of Todd's office. The impact was jarring. The airbags did not deploy in a car that old, so my head snapped forward, hitting the steering wheel, just hard enough to split my lip and daze me. The beautiful hood of the car crumpled like cheap tin, and a thick cloud of white steam hissed from the shattered radiator. Immediately, people rushed out of the nearby buildings. I heard shouts and the rapid dialing of cell phones. I slumped back into my seat, smearing the small amount of blood from my lip across my forehead to make it look worse than it actually was. I began to practice my performance. When the loud sirens approached and the paramedics finally yanked open my crushed car door, I did not act like the sharp, commanding executive I had been my entire life. I let my eyes glaze over completely. I let my jaw go slack. A young paramedic shined a bright penlight into my eyes and asked me for my name. I stared right through him, my hands trembling violently. I began to ramble in a breathless, terrified voice. I told him I was late for a board meeting that had taken place 20 years ago. I kept asking where my late wife was, demanding they find her because she was waiting for me with the groceries. The paramedic spoke gently to me, placing a thick cervical collar around my neck, exchanging a worried glance with his partner. They carefully pulled me from the wreckage and laid me flat on a stiff backboard. As they wheeled me toward the waiting ambulance, a police officer asked the paramedic where they were taking me. This was the most crucial moment of my entire plan. I grabbed the sleeve of the paramedic, my grip weak and desperate. I sobbed out a specific request, a detail I had meticulously researched. I begged them to take me to the private hospital located on the north side of the city. I told them my regular doctor was there, Dr. Eris Thorne. I repeated his name over and over in a frantic, confused loop, weeping that he was the only doctor my wife trusted. In medical emergencies involving the elderly and confused, paramedics will often accommodate a specific hospital request if the facility is fully equipped and the patient insists upon a known physician. The paramedic nodded sympathetically, telling the police officer they were diverting to the north side private facility to ensure continuity of care for a severe dementia patient. They loaded me into the back of the ambulance, the heavy doors slamming shut behind me. The ride was loud and chaotic, but inside my mind, everything was dead silent and perfectly clear. I had successfully bypassed the gatekeepers. I was being delivered directly to the doorstep of the enemy. When we arrived at the hospital, the emergency room staff rushed me through the pristine white corridors. Because I had named Dr. Thorne, and because my name matched the recent psychiatric complaints filed in the system, I was not placed in a standard holding room. I was quickly wheeled up to the high-security psychiatric observation ward. Nurses stripped me of my clothes, dressed me in a thin hospital gown, and firmly strapped my wrists and ankles to the metal bed rails. The leather restraints bit into my skin, mirroring the exact nightmare my son was enduring. I did not fight them. I let my head loll to the side, maintaining the illusion of a completely broken, medicated mind. I was a helpless old man lost in the fog of a shattered reality. The heavy door to my private room clicked shut, leaving me in the dim, quiet light. I waited in absolute stillness. Less than an hour later, the heavy door swung open again. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing shallow and erratic. 2 sets of footsteps approached the side of my bed. I recognized the expensive leather shoes immediately. It was Todd, accompanied by the clinical presence of Dr. Thorne. They stood directly over me, unaware that I was listening. Todd whispered about how easy it was to neutralize the old man. His voice was dripping with arrogant satisfaction that made my blood boil beneath my thin hospital gown. I kept my eyes shut and allowed my breathing to remain shallow and irregular. Todd chuckled softly, a sound so cold and devoid of human empathy, it sent a shiver down my spine. Dr. Thorne responded with a murmur, confirming the heavy sedatives they ordered for me were being prepared. He assured Todd I would be kept in a permanent state of confusion, removing me from any legal or financial proceedings. Moments later, the heavy door clicked open again. Dr. Thorne excused himself to check on his other patients, leaving Todd alone in the room. Or so I thought. I heard the unmistakable click of designer heels against the sterile floor. It was Valerie. She must have arrived shortly after I was admitted, eager to see the completion of their puzzle. She walked up to the side of my bed and let out a dramatic sigh. She told Todd seeing me strapped to the metal rails was the most beautiful thing she had seen all week. What neither of them knew was that the small beige device tucked behind my right ear was not a standard medical hearing aid. During my tenure as the chief executive officer of a cybersecurity firm, I handled highly sensitive corporate espionage cases. I commissioned a custom piece of hardware for my own personal security. It was a military-grade voice-activated digital recording device capable of capturing crystal-clear audio and transmitting it directly to a secure cloud server managed by my hacker associate, Leon. Every single word they were whispering over my supposed deathbed was being meticulously documented, time-stamped, and saved as irrefutable digital evidence. Todd stepped closer to my bed, the scent of his expensive cologne wafting over me. He praised Valerie for her flawless execution of the plan thus far. He said the board of directors was already terrified by the sudden mental collapse of both the founder and his father. He explained the investors were begging him to take executive control to stabilize the crashing stock prices. But to finalize the sale to the Department of Defense, he still needed my son to physically sign the corporate transfer papers. Valerie scoffed quietly, asking how they were supposed to get a heavily drugged catatonic man to sign a massive stack of complicated legal documents without raising suspicion. Todd's tone turned incredibly dark and serious. He leaned over my bed so close I could feel his breath against my cheek. He laid out the final phase of his master plan with chilling precision. He told Valerie they were going to bring Derek to this hospital room tomorrow morning. The official cover story for the hospital staff and the media would be a tragic family emergency. They would claim that Derek, despite his severe psychiatric struggles, was being brought in to say a final heartbreaking goodbye to his dying father, who had just suffered a massive stroke. Todd explained that the overwhelming emotional distress of seeing me in this vegetative state would perfectly explain Derek's erratic behavior and physical weakness to anyone who saw them in the hallways. Valerie hummed in agreement, noting the hospital staff was already paid generously to look the other way when Dr. Thorne's VIP patients were involved. Todd instructed her to withhold my son's sedatives just enough so that he could hold a pen and vaguely understand the commands he was given. They would place the corporate transfer documents on the tray table right next to my bed. Todd said he would physically guide Derek's hand if he had to. He did not care how messy the signature looked as long as the ink hit the paper. The moment those documents were signed, Todd would possess total legal control over the $150 million artificial intelligence algorithm. I lay perfectly still, my mind racing. I had the confession. I had the motive. I had the evidence being silently beamed to Leon. I thought this was the absolute peak of their cruelty. I thought their ultimate goal was merely financial theft and my permanent institutionalization. I was horribly wrong. Valerie asked Todd what they were supposed to do with Derek after the papers were signed. She complained that keeping him locked in the guest bedroom was becoming a logistical nightmare, and she was tired of playing the role of the devoted, tragic girlfriend. She wanted her $2 million payment, and she wanted out of Seattle by the end of the week. Todd did not hesitate. His voice was devoid of emotion, as if he were discussing the disposal of a broken piece of office furniture, rather than the life of his best friend and business partner. He told Valerie once the ink was dry on the transfer papers, Derek would no longer be a necessary asset. He instructed her to take Derek back to the Mercer Island house. Once inside the master bedroom, she was to prepare a syringe. He told her to give Derek a lethal dosage of fentanyl. My heart slammed violently against my ribs, and it took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to open my eyes and strangle him with my bare hands. Todd calmly explained the narrative they would sell to the police. They would frame the murder as a tragic drug-induced suicide. They would tell the authorities the immense grief of losing his company, combined with the profound trauma of seeing his father in a vegetative state, was simply too much for Derek's fragile mind to handle. They would claim he stole the drugs from Valerie's medical bag and ended his own life in a fit of despair. No single person would question the grieving business partner. No single person would question the heartbroken nurse. They would walk away with hundreds of millions of dollars, leaving me rotting in a psychiatric ward and my son buried in the cold ground. The early morning sun bled through the thin horizontal blinds, casting cage-like shadows across the sterile floor. I spent the night locked in hypervigilance, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed. Whenever a nurse checked on me, I maintained the vacant stare of a broken man. But beneath the blanket, my muscles coiled tight, ready for the nightmare walking through my door. At 10 o'clock, the heavy door swung open. The noise from the hallway was cut off as it shut. I kept my eyes half open, letting my gaze drift toward the ceiling tiles. I heard the unmistakable squeak of rubber wheelchair tires rolling onto the linoleum. Valerie pushed the chair to the right side of my bed and locked the wheels. I did not turn my head, but from my peripheral vision, I saw him. My heart shattered. Derek was slumped forward, his chin resting heavily against his chest. He was wearing the same button-down shirt from our Sunday dinner, but it was now deeply wrinkled and stained. His skin was the color of old parchment, and his dark eyes were sunken deep into his skull, completely devoid of intelligence. He looked like an empty vessel. Valerie had withheld his heavy sedatives just enough to keep him awake, but he was entirely disconnected from reality, his breathing shallow and labored. Todd entered seconds later, followed by the crisp footsteps of two men carrying leather briefcases. They were the corporate lawyers. Todd immediately launched into his theatrical performance. He spoke in a hushed, mournful tone, thanking the attorneys for accommodating this highly irregular setting. He fed them a perfectly rehearsed lie explaining Derek was devastated by my stroke and wanted to finalize the corporate transfer right here by my side before taking a leave of absence to mourn. The lawyers offered shallow condolences and quickly unpacked their documents. They placed a thick stack of papers on the plastic hospital tray table and rolled it directly in front of Derek. I watched through half-closed eyes as the horrific theater unfolded. Valerie stood behind the wheelchair, gripping Derek by the shoulders to keep him sitting upright. Todd stepped forward, pulling a gold fountain pen from his pocket. He spoke to my son with a sickeningly sweet voice, treating him like a confused child. Todd told Derek everything was going to be all right, that he just needed to sign his name on the dotted line so they could secure the future of the company. Derek did not respond. He stared blankly at the tray table, a thin line of saliva gathering at the corner of his mouth. Todd did not wait for any sort of vocal response from my heavily medicated son. He reached out and grabbed the limp right hand of my son. Derek possessed absolutely no motor control, his fingers curled loosely inward. Todd clicked his tongue in mild annoyance and pulled a roll of clear medical tape from Valerie's pocket. Right in front of the highly paid corporate lawyers, Todd forced the gold pen between my son's fingers and tightly wrapped the adhesive tape around his knuckles, physically binding the pen to his hand. The lawyers did not say a single word. They simply looked down at their polished shoes, entirely complicit in the theft of $150 million technology. Todd leaned over, grabbing Derek by the wrist. He pressed the tip of the gold pen onto the signature line of the first legal document. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick paper echoed loudly in the quiet hospital room. Todd was practically dragging my son's hand across the page, forcing him to trace his own name. I felt an overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated rage burn through my veins. Every instinct I had as a father screamed at me to rip the leather restraints off my wrists, leap out of the bed, and tear Todd apart with my bare hands. But I knew that if I broke my cover now, I would lose everything. The lawyers would testify that I was violently unhinged. Valerie would rush Derek out of the room, and the lethal dose of fentanyl waiting for him back at the house would be administered before I could ever reach him. I had to let the crime happen. I had to let them think they had won. Todd moved to the second page, growing impatient. He pulled Derek's arm forcefully to the right to sign the next line, but he pulled too hard. Derek's weakened body shifted in the wheelchair, and his heavy arm slipped off the plastic tray table. The taped pen clattered against the metal bed frame, and my son's limp hand fell directly onto the edge of my mattress, slipping just beneath the edge of my thin hospital blanket. Todd cursed under his breath, apologizing to the lawyers for the delay. He reached down to grab Derek's wrist again. But in that brief, chaotic second before Todd could pull his arm away, I moved. Under the concealment of the white cotton blanket, my fingers brushed against the incredibly cold, trembling hand of my son. I did not hesitate. I wrapped my hand tightly around his freezing fingers. 1, 2, 3. I am right here. Todd grabbed his wrist and yanked his arm back up to the tray table. But as Todd forced the pen back onto the paper, I saw a profound change in my son. Derek did not open his eyes any wider. He did not make a single sound. But his chest, which had been rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps, suddenly hitched. He drew in a long, deep breath. The violent trembling in his jaw stopped completely. Beneath the heavy layer of toxic chemicals clouding his brain, a tiny spark of awareness ignited. He felt the message. He knew his father was awake, and he knew he was no longer fighting this war alone. I held my son's freezing fingers for just a second longer, transmitting all the silent strength I possessed, before letting my hand slide back down to my side beneath the thin hospital blanket. Todd let out a sharp sigh of profound irritation, completely oblivious to the silent exchange that had just occurred right in front of him. He roughly grabbed Derek by the forearm, yanking his limp body back into an upright position in the wheelchair. He muttered a quick apology to the corporate lawyers, claiming the heavy medication was making my son incredibly clumsy. Todd reset the plastic tray table, smoothing out the crumpled transfer document, and prepared to force the gold fountain pen back onto the signature line. He told Derek to stop fighting and just let it happen. I knew I had no more time. The moment that pen touched the paper, the legal battle would become infinitely more complicated, and my son would be marked for an immediate lethal injection. I could not let him sign that document, nor could I let Valerie take him back to that house. It was time to initiate the protocol I had established with Leon before I ever drove my vintage Porsche into that brick wall. When the hospital staff stripped me of my clothes and dressed me in this thin gown and scrub bottoms, they completely failed to thoroughly check the thick elastic waistband. Embedded deep within the fabric of my own underwear, which I had refused to take off, was a microscopic waterproof transmitter sewn into the hem by Leon. It was a panic button operating on an encrypted radio frequency that bypassed the hospital network entirely. I shifted my weight on the stiff mattress, feigning a weak, involuntary muscle spasm. I slid my left hand down my side, my fingers desperately tracing the line of my hip until I felt the small, hard ridge hidden beneath the cotton. I pressed the tiny button, firmly holding it down for 3 full seconds. The signal shot silently through the airwaves, traveling miles across the city, directly to the dark warehouse where Leon sat, waiting at his computer terminal. For 5 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Todd guided Derek's hand closer to the paper. The gold nib was hovering barely a fraction of an inch above the designated line. Then the entire building violently erupted. A deafening, shrill, mechanical siren shattered the quiet tension of the psychiatric ward. Brilliant white strobe lights mounted on the ceiling began to flash with an incredibly aggressive and blinding intensity, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the sterile walls. The 2 highly paid corporate lawyers immediately dropped their leather briefcases in sheer panic, covering their ears and looking frantically toward the heavy door. Todd stumbled backward, dropping the wrist of my son in shock. He shouted over the deafening alarm, demanding to know what was happening, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled. Valerie covered her head with her hands, screaming. But Leon did not just trigger the fire alarms. He hacked directly into the automated safety infrastructure of the entire medical facility. A loud metallic click echoed from the ceiling panels above us. A split second later, the high-pressure fire suppression sprinklers activated with explosive force. Freezing, murky water blasted down upon us in a torrential downpour. The heavy spray soaked the entire room instantly. The pristine transfer documents sitting on the plastic tray table were immediately annihilated. The thick black ink of the legal text bled across the soaking wet paper, dissolving into an unreadable, soggy mess. Todd lunged forward with a desperate cry, throwing his expensive suit jacket over the tray table in a frantic attempt to save the $150 million contracts, but it was completely useless. The paper tore apart under the heavy water pressure. His master plan was literally disintegrating right before his eyes. Amidst the blinding strobe lights, the deafening sirens, and the freezing rain, the heavy door to my hospital room violently burst open. 3 large men wearing bright yellow high-visibility emergency medical technician jackets stormed into the room. Their faces were partially obscured by heavy oxygen masks and thick protective visors, but I immediately recognized the man leading the charge. It was Mitchell Gallagher. He had traded his tailored corporate suit for the rugged gear of a first responder. Flanking him were 2 massive, heavily muscled men who moved with the undeniable, terrifying precision of ex-military private security contractors. Mitchell barked authoritative orders over the chaotic noise, screaming that there was an active fire in the ventilation shafts and they needed to evacuate immediately. The lawyers did not hesitate. They shoved past Todd, abandoning their ruined briefcases, and fled into the hallway. Todd tried to assert his authority. He stepped in front of Derek, yelling at Mitchell that they were in the middle of a confidential legal proceeding and that they were not leaving the room. The two contractors did not pause to argue. They moved with an absolute brutal efficiency. One contractor shoved Todd forcefully against the wet wall, pinning the tech executive helplessly against the plaster. The second contractor grabbed the handles of Derek's wheelchair, swiftly kicking the wheel locks free. Valerie tried to grab the armrest, screaming that she was the legal medical proxy and they could not take him. Mitchell grabbed her wrist with a vice-like grip, shoved her back toward Todd, and yelled that emergency evacuation protocols superseded all private medical directives. He looked at me lying completely still on the soaked bed and gave me a single imperceptible nod. It was the confirmation I needed. The contractors spun the wheelchair around, rushing my bewildered, soaking wet son out into the flashing, screaming chaos of the hospital corridor. Before Todd or Valerie could even regain their balance, the fake medical team pushed Derek straight toward the restricted service elevators, completely vanishing behind the closing metal doors, stealing my son right out from under their noses. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing my son away, I knew my window for escape was closing. The freezing water from the sprinklers continued to blast down, flooding the sterile hospital room and creating pandemonium. Todd was pinned against the wet wall by the sheer force of his own panic and the shock of the sudden extraction. Valerie was screaming hysterically at the empty hallway, demanding the nurses call the police. Neither of them was paying any attention to the old man lying on the soaked mattress. I reached down and swiftly unbuckled the leather restraints binding my wrists and ankles. I dropped the dementia act instantly. My mind was sharp and my body moved with the precision of a much younger man. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet hitting the puddle on the floor. I grabbed a dry scrub jacket from a nearby supply cart, threw it over my thin hospital gown, and walked straight out of the room. I did not run. Running attracts attention. I blended into the crowd of evacuating patients, shouting nurses and confused security guards. I slipped down a secondary stairwell that Leon had mapped out for me, bypassing the main lobby entirely. I pushed through the emergency exit doors and stepped out into the cold Seattle air. A black utility van was idling in the dark alleyway behind the hospital kitchens. The side door slid open, revealing Mitchell sitting inside with his laptop glowing in the dim light. I climbed in, soaked and shivering, but I had never felt more alive. Mitchell handed me a dry towel and clean clothes as the van sped away from the flashing lights of the medical center. He told me the contractors had successfully secured Derek and were already en route to our extraction point. We drove for 45 minutes, leaving the city limits behind, winding our way up a remote mountain road until we reached a heavily fortified, off-the-grid cabin. It was an old safe house I had purchased decades ago during a corporate espionage case devoid of smart technology, internet connections, or digital footprints. When we arrived, the contractors had already moved Derek into the main bedroom. He was lying on a thick mattress, shivering violently beneath heavy wool blankets. The real nightmare was just beginning. The heavy sedatives and chemicals Valerie had been pumping into his veins for weeks were finally beginning to wear off, and his central nervous system was going into a state of shock. For the next 48 hours, I did not sleep, and I did not leave his side. The withdrawal was brutal, violent, and merciless. Derek tossed and turned in pure agony, his body slick with a sweat. He vomited until his stomach was empty, dry, heaving until he could barely breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding a plastic basin for him, wiping his burning forehead with a damp cloth. At his lowest points, the psychological terror of the drugs took hold. He hallucinated, screaming into the dark room, begging Valerie not to hurt him anymore, pleading with Todd to let him go. Every scream felt like a knife twisting into my heart. I grabbed his thrashing shoulders, pinning him to the mattress so he would not injure himself. And I spoke to him in a low, steady voice. I told him he was safe. I told him his father was there, and I would never let them touch him again. By the second night, the seizures began. His body locked up, his back arching off the mattress as tremors racked his muscles. Mitchell stood in the doorway, his face pale with worry, asking if we needed to risk calling an ambulance. I refused. I knew that taking him to a hospital would put him back on the digital grid, exposing him to Todd and Dr. Thorne before we had the evidence we needed to destroy them. I held my son down with my strength, cradling his head to protect his skull from the headboard, whispering our old childhood codes into his ear. I squeezed his hand over and over. 1, 2, 3, 4. I absorbed his pain, promising to return every ounce of this suffering back to the monsters who had inflicted it upon him. Finally, as the sun began to rise on the third morning, the shaking subsided. The fever broke. Derek opened his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, the hollow emptiness was gone. He looked up at me, his breathing weak but steady, and a tear rolled down his pale cheek. With Derek stable, Mitchell brought in a trusted contact. He was an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Mitchell a favor. The doctor arrived with a medical case moving quietly. He drew several vials of blood from the veins in the arm of my son and set up a centrifuge right on the kitchen table. The cabin was dead silent as we waited for the analysis to complete. I sat next to Derek, feeding him sips of water, praying that the worst of the damage was over. 2 hours later, the toxicologist walked into the bedroom, his face drawn and grim. He held a report in his hand. He looked directly at me and stated that what he found was unprecedented. The cocktail Valerie had been administering was not just a mix of industrial tranquilizers and sedatives. The toxicologist pointed to a compound isolated in the blood work. He explained that it was a rare illegal neurotoxin. It was designed to degrade the neural pathways, perfectly mimicking the symptoms of degenerative brain disease. If Derek had taken those pills for even one more week, his brain function would have been destroyed. This was not just a case of medical abuse or chemical restraint. Todd and Valerie had not just planned to steal his company. They had been administering a lethal poison. It was cold, calculated, premeditated, attempted murder. The toxicologist packed up his medical equipment in silence. The gravity of his revelation hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I thanked the doctor, and Mitchell escorted him out into the night. I walked back into the bedroom and looked at my son. Derek was finally sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and rhythmic, untainted by the chemical poisons that had ravaged his body for so many weeks. The violent tremors had stopped, and for the first time he looked like my boy again. I pulled the heavy wool blanket up to his shoulders and turned off the bedside lamp. The medical crisis was over. Now it was time for the financial execution. I walked out to the kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened my encrypted laptop. I had the physical evidence of their medical crimes, but to destroy Todd in a court of law, I needed to follow the money. I needed the undeniable paper trail that connected the wealthy tech executive to the black market nurse. I opened a secure communication channel to Leon. He had been monitoring the digital fallout from our hospital extraction and was waiting for my next command. I told him I needed to map Todd's personal financial network, looking for dark web transactions and offshore shell companies. I gave Leon the exact date when Valerie first appeared in the life of my son, assuming that was when the initial deposit was made. The screen turned black, filling with lines of green code as Leon bypassed the banking firewalls and dove directly into the cryptocurrency exchanges Todd favored. It took Leon 3 hours to unravel the web of digital wallets Todd had used to hide his tracks. Todd was arrogant, but he was not a professional criminal. He had used automated coin mixers to scramble the funds, hoping to break the chain of custody. But Leon was a ghost who wrote the very algorithms Todd was trying to hide behind. Just past midnight, Leon hit the jackpot. He sent an encrypted file to my desktop. I opened it and stared at the digital ledger. There it was, laid out in black and white. 3 weeks before Derek was diagnosed with the fake disorder, Todd had liquidated a significant portion of his stock options. He converted the funds into a cryptocurrency and transferred it to an offshore account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Leon Cross referenced the corporate officers of that shell company. The sole proprietor was Valerie. The total amount transferred was exactly $2 million. It was a perfectly documented murder for hire payment. But I knew Todd well enough to know he would not risk a $2 million investment without guaranteeing his $150 million return. I messaged Leon again, instructing him to breach the secure corporate servers of the software company. I told him to pull every deleted email draft and communication between Todd and the Department of Defense officers. Leon warned me that hacking into a server communicating with military contractors was dangerous and could trigger a cybersecurity response. I told him I did not care about the alarms anymore. I needed the smoking gun. 10 minutes later, a folder of restored communications downloaded onto my screen. I began reading through the email threads between Todd and the government liaisons. Todd had been secretly negotiating the sale of the algorithm for months behind the back of my son. But the most damning piece of evidence was an attachment buried in an email sent 2 days before our Sunday dinner. It was a draft of the asset transfer agreement sent to the military lawyers for a review. I zoomed in on the signature page of the digital document. My blood turned to ice. The document bore the signature of my son authorizing the sale of his 51% stake in the company. But Derek had refused to sell. He had never signed that document. I compared the digital signature on the military contract to the jagged signature on the fake medical power of attorney I still carried in my coat pocket. They were different. Todd had forged the signature of my son to keep the government buyers interested while he finalized his plan to medically incapacitate Derek and take legal control. Todd was not just guilty of attempted murder and medical extortion. He had committed federal wire fraud and forged documents submitted to the United States military. The arrogance of the man was staggering. He believed he was untouchable, operating under the assumption that his wealth and influence would shield him from any real scrutiny. I downloaded every file, ledger, and email onto 3 encrypted flash drives, securing the destruction of his empire. Just as I pulled the final flash drive from my computer, the heavy door of the cabin opened. Mitchell walked in from the cold, his cell phone pressed to his ear. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. He ended the call and walked over to the kitchen table, looking down at the glowing screen of my laptop. He took a deep breath and delivered the final piece of the puzzle. Mitchell informed me that his contacts at the county courthouse had just intercepted a legal filing. Todd had submitted an emergency petition to a judge in the city. He was claiming that Derek had been kidnapped from the psychiatric hospital by unknown assailants and was now legally missing and presumed in grave danger. Todd was using the chaos we created to his advantage. He had scheduled an emergency court hearing for tomorrow morning. He was demanding that the judge declare Derek legally incapacitated and missing, granting Todd full and total executive control of the software company to finalize the government sale and save the business from collapsing. Todd believed his brilliant plan had worked. He truly thought he had outsmarted us all. He thought he had finally won this very dark game. I listened to Mitchell explain the emergency petition. Todd was using the legal system to cement his theft before anyone asked questions about the hospital chaos. He had petitioned a specific judge known for fast-tracking corporate disputes. Mitchell paced across the worn wooden floor, outlining defensive strategies we could employ to pause the hearing. But I raised my hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I told Mitchell we were not going to play defense. We were not going to file for a continuance, and we were not going to seek a private settlement. I looked my lawyer directly in the eyes and established the absolute rules of engagement. I told him we were going to walk right into that courtroom and let Todd present his fabricated story under oath, and then we were going to publicly slaughter them. We would present the forged military documents, the crypto ledgers, and the toxicologist report in open court. We were going to trap them in a perjury cage so tight They would never see the outside of a prison. Mitchell nodded slowly, a predatory smile creeping across his face as he realized the sheer scale of the retaliation I was planning. He immediately began drafting our counter-filings, organizing the encrypted flash drives into a lethal sequence of evidence. I left him to his work. The sun was just beginning to peek over the distant tree line, casting a cold light through the cabin windows. The time for hiding was officially over. I drove the utility van into a nearby suburban town, waiting for an exclusive luxury menswear boutique to open. When the owner unlocked the entrance, I walked in and purchased a brand new bespoke charcoal gray suit. I did not care about the exorbitant price tag. I needed armor. I needed to shed the image of the helpless old man in the soaked hospital gown. I needed Todd and Valerie to look at me and instantly recognize the ruthless corporate executive they had foolishly tried to bury. I paired the suit with a crisp white shirt and a solid black tie, making sure every single detail was impeccably sharp. I was preparing for a war of attrition, and my appearance was the first weapon I would deploy. I returned to the safe house just as the morning light fully illuminated the surrounding forest. I carried a second garment bag into the bedroom, where my son was slowly waking up. Derek was sitting on the edge of the mattress, drinking a glass of water. He looked incredibly fragile, his cheekbones sharp, and his skin still pale, but his eyes were focused. The toxic fog had completely lifted from his mind. I unzipped the garment bag and laid out a tailored navy blue suit I had purchased for him. I told him today was the day we took his life back. Derek nodded silently, but his hands were still shaking slightly from the lingering weakness of the brutal withdrawal. I did not rush him. I stepped forward and helped my grown son get dressed, just as I had done when he was a little boy preparing for school. I guided his arms into the sleeves of the crisp shirt, carefully buttoning the cuffs around his thin wrists. I tied his necktie for him, adjusting the knot until it sat perfectly against his collar. As I smoothed the fabric of his jacket over his shoulders, he looked at his reflection in the small bedroom mirror. He took a deep, shuddering breath, standing taller, finding his strength in the reflection of the man he was supposed to be. We walked out into the main living area of the cabin, completely transformed. Mitchell looked up from his glowing laptop screen and whistled in approval. We gathered around the small wooden kitchen table for one final review of our execution strategy. I made sure every piece of the puzzle was perfectly locked into place. The independent toxicologist was on standby, ready to testify to the attempted chemical murder. The former military security contractors were positioned near the courthouse to ensure Valerie did not attempt a desperate escape when the truth dropped. Leon had successfully forwarded the digital evidence packets to Mitchell's secure server, ready to be displayed on the large monitors inside the courtroom. Everything was meticulously arranged. We were not just going to win a legal dispute. We were going to orchestrate a devastating, unavoidable public reckoning. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. We packed up the encrypted drives and the thick paper files, securing them in Mitchell's heavy leather briefcase. It was time to leave the sanctuary of the mountains and drive back down into the belly of the beast. We loaded into the back of the unmarked utility van for the drive to the city courthouse. The journey was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts of the impending confrontation. As we merged onto the main highway, my old cell phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. It was the phone I had left entirely silent since the night I crashed my car into the brick mailbox. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from Todd. He believed I was still strapped to a bed in the psychiatric ward, heavily medicated and completely unaware of my surroundings. He thought he was texting a ghost, taunting a man who could not defend himself. The message was dripping with sickening arrogance. He wrote, "Rest easy, old man. I will take good care of the Empire." I stared at the glowing digital words, feeling a profound sense of absolute calm wash over my body. I did not block the number. I did not type out a long, angry response. I simply used my thumb to type 4 very specific words. "See you tomorrow, Todd." I pressed send, turned the phone off, and slipped it back into my pocket. The massive storm was finally right here. We arrived at the downtown courthouse just before 9 in the morning. The imposing granite building stood like a fortress against the gray Seattle sky. Mitchell parked the unmarked utility van in a restricted loading zone, flashing a familiar badge to the security guard to ensure our discreet entry through the underground garage. We took the service elevator up to the 4th floor, avoiding the main lobby where reporters might be lurking. We stood in the cold, quiet, marble-lined corridor just outside of courtroom 4. I placed a reassuring hand on the shoulder of my son. Derek took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blue suit. The physical weakness was still there, a lingering shadow of the chemical torture he had endured, but the absolute determination radiating from his dark eyes was unbreakable. He nodded at me silently, signaling he was ready to face the man who tried to bury him alive. Mitchell carefully cracked the heavy oak door open just a fraction of an inch, allowing us to see and hear the proceedings inside without being noticed by anyone. The courtroom was relatively empty, which was typical for an emergency injunction hearing scheduled at the last minute. Sitting at the polished wooden plaintiff table were Todd and Valerie. They had dressed perfectly for the deceptive parts they were playing. Todd wore a conservative dark gray suit, his shoulders slightly hunched to project the heavy burden of a grieving business partner. Valerie sat right beside him, wearing a modest black dress, her hair pulled back, simply dabbing at her dry eyes with a white tissue. Standing before the elevated bench was the attorney Todd had hired, presenting the fabricated tragedy to a stern-looking judge. The attorney painted a terrifying, heartbreaking picture for the court. He claimed Derek had suffered a catastrophic, irreversible mental breakdown. He submitted the forged medical evaluations signed by Dr. Thorne, detailing the fake schizophrenia diagnosis. Then he moved on to me. He formally informed the judge that I, the only living relative, had suffered a massive, debilitating stroke and was currently lying in a vegetative state in a psychiatric ward, completely incapable of managing my affairs or stepping in to help my son. Todd stood up from the plaintiff table respectfully, asking the judge for permission to speak directly. The judge granted it immediately. Todd placed his hands flat on the polished wood, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. He told the judge that his heart was completely broken for his best friend, but the software company they had built together was currently in severe jeopardy. He explained that a critical time-sensitive military contract was pending, and without an authorized executive to sign the final documents, the business would completely collapse, leaving hundreds of innocent employees without jobs. He lied under oath with a sickening grace that made my stomach turn. He begged the court to grant him immediate unilateral executive control over the corporate shares of my son, framing it as a desperate measure to protect the financial legacy of a man who was no longer capable of protecting himself. He added a sinister twist, stating that Derek had been violently abducted from the hospital the previous day by unknown individuals, and that gaining control of the corporate assets was the necessary way to fund a private investigation to find his missing friend. The judge listened carefully to every word, his expression entirely solemn. He adjusted his silver reading glasses and slowly flipped through the thick stack of fraudulent documents Todd had provided. To a judge unaware of the massive criminal conspiracy, the tragic narrative made absolute logical sense. The medical records appeared entirely legitimate and properly notarized. The corporate bylaws allowed for emergency proxy control in the event of severe incapacitation. The judge let out a heavy sigh, acknowledging the tragic nature of the situation. He stated for the official court record that given the immediate financial threat to the corporate entity and the severe medical incapacity of both the primary shareholder and his elderly father, the court had no other choice but to intervene. The judge reached across the heavy wooden bench, picking up his black fountain pen. He positioned the gold nib directly over the final signature line of the emergency injunction order. If that ink touched the paper, Todd would instantly become the sole legal dictator of the algorithm, and Derek would be officially classified as a missing, mentally incompetent person, making his eventual murder infinitely easier to legally conceal. The massive courtroom was completely dead silent, waiting for the final scratch of the pen to seal our fate. Mitchell looked back at me and gave a sharp nod. It was time to end this charade. I reached out and pushed both heavy oak doors with all the strength I possessed. The massive brass hinges groaned loudly, the sound echoing like a violent gunshot through the quiet, cavernous courtroom. The judge instantly stopped his pen, hovering just a millimeter above the paper, and looked up in absolute shock. The courtroom bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting cautiously on his radio. Todd and Valerie whipped their heads around to look at the back of the room. I walked very slowly down the long center aisle, my back perfectly straight, my eyes locked directly onto Todd, like sharp flint. I was not wearing a soaked hospital gown. I was wearing a $5,000 bespoke suit, moving with the terrifying, undeniable authority of a man who had successfully built and destroyed corporate empires. But I was not the one who made the blood freeze in their veins. Walking right behind me, his head held very high and his stride perfectly steady, was my son Derek. He was pale, but he was completely lucid, impeccably dressed, and undeniably alive. The white tissue fell from the trembling hands of Valerie, fluttering silently to the floor. The color violently and instantly drained from the terrified face of Todd. The attorney representing Todd immediately began to stammer aggressively, shuffling his perfectly organized files in a desperate attempt to regain control of the shattered narrative. He quickly looked directly at me and then at my son, and loudly shouted to the judge that this was a highly inappropriate interruption. He claimed that Derek was clearly under the heavy influence of severe psychiatric medication, forced into this courtroom, against his will, by a delusional father who had simply wandered out of a hospital ward. Todd quickly found his own voice, nodding his head vigorously, his face still appearing ghostly pale. He told the judge that I was suffering from profound dementia, that I was a danger to myself, and that this dramatic stunt only proved how desperately Derek needed immediate legal protection. They were clinging to their sinking ship with everything they had, hoping the sheer audacity of their lies would somehow overshadow the living, breathing truth standing right in front of them. The judge looked extremely displeased, raising his wooden gavel and demanding order in his courtroom, asking Mitchell to identify himself and explain this massive breach of judicial protocol. Mitchell did not flinch. He walked confidently past the plaintiff table, entirely ignoring the frantic objections of the opposing counsel. He introduced himself to the court, stating his name and his credentials as the legal representative for both Victor and Derek. He informed the judge that no legal documents needed to be signed today because the entire premise of this emergency hearing was built upon a foundation of criminal fraud, medical extortion, and premeditated attempted murder. The word murder hung in the cold air of the courtroom, completely silencing the frantic whispers of the opposing lawyers. The judge leaned forward over his heavy wooden bench. His eyes narrowed in deep skepticism, warning Mitchell that he was making extraordinarily severe accusations and had better possess the immediate physical evidence to back them up. Mitchell simply nodded. He unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He walked directly over to the clerk desk, politely requesting permission to use the courtroom multimedia system. The judge granted it with a curt wave of his hand. Mitchell plugged the small drive into the computer terminal. He looked back at Todd, offering a cold, terrifying smile before he pressed the play button. The high-definition audio recording captured by my military-grade hearing aid suddenly crackled to life, echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers mounted on the courtroom walls. First, there was the rhythmic mechanical beeping of my hospital heart monitor, establishing the setting perfectly. Then came the chilling, unmistakable voice of Todd. His recorded voice filled the large room, dripping with an arrogant satisfaction that made the actual Todd physically shrink back into his wooden chair. The court listened in stunned, absolute silence as the recorded version of Todd praised Valerie for her flawless execution of the plan to neutralize the old man. We heard Valerie let out a dramatic sigh, complaining about how tired she was of playing the devoted girlfriend, asking when she would get her $2 million payment. The opposing lawyer dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against his desk, but nobody looked away from the speakers. The recording continued escalating into the darkest corners of their conspiracy. The voice of Todd grew colder, more calculated, as he laid out the final phase of their master plan. Every single horrific detail was broadcast for the judge to hear. Todd clearly instructed Valerie to withhold the sedatives just enough to get Derek to sign the corporate transfer papers. Then came the ultimate death blow. The audio captured Todd telling Valerie to take Derek back to the Mercer Island house, prepare a syringe, and give him a lethal dosage of fentanyl. The casual, cruel laugh that escaped Valerie on the recording made the blood of everyone in the room run completely cold. They discussed framing the murder as a tragic drug-induced suicide caused by grief over my fake stroke. Every word was crystal clear. Every horrific intention was laid bare under the bright fluorescent lights of the judicial system. The recording ended with the heavy click of a hospital door closing. The silence that followed in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The judge stared down at the plaintiff table with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The opposing attorney physically took 2 steps away from Todd, instinctively distancing himself from a man who had just been exposed as a calculating murderer on the public record. Todd was completely paralyzed. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. His chest heaved as he frantically looked around the room, realizing that his $150 million empire, his reputation, and his freedom had just evaporated in less than 3 minutes of audio. But Valerie did not freeze. The survival instincts of a black market criminal kicked in immediately. She realized the staggering magnitude of the evidence presented against her. She jumped up from her chair so violently that it tipped over backward, crashing against the wooden railing. Without looking at Todd or the judge, she spun around and sprinted desperately up the center aisle toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. She was fast fueled by the sheer terror of spending the rest of her life in a federal prison. She reached out her hands, slamming against the brass handles to push her way out into the corridor. But the heavy doors did not open outward. Instead, they were firmly pushed inward from the other side. Valerie stumbled backward, gasping for breath, as 2 massive figures stepped into the doorway, completely blocking the only exit. They were federal marshals wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests, with their badges prominently displayed over their chests. Mitchell had tipped them off last night, providing them with enough preliminary evidence to secure immediate federal arrest warrants. Valerie was trapped. The 2 federal marshals did not hesitate. They grabbed Valerie by both her arms, twisting them firmly behind her back. The loud click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the courtroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. Valerie screamed a shrill sound, kicking her heels against the solid doors, but the marshals held her completely still, reading her the federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder and medical fraud. The judge banged his wooden gavel against the block with explosive force, demanding absolute order and threatening to hold anyone who spoke out of turn in direct criminal contempt. The bailiff rushed forward, standing behind the plaintiff table where Todd was visibly shaking. The wealthy tech executive who orchestrated this living nightmare was suddenly looking at the absolute destruction of his life. But Mitchell was not finished. He had only just begun to dismantle them. Mitchell stepped away from the multimedia terminal and walked back to his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out a bright red folder and carried it directly to the bench, handing it up to the attentive judge. Mitchell spoke with a clear, unwavering authority that commanded the entire room. He stated that the audio recording was merely the declaration of their malicious intent, but the red folder contained the physical proof of their ongoing criminal actions. He told the court that inside that file was a comprehensive blood analysis conducted by a highly respected private toxicologist just 24 hours ago, immediately after we extracted Derek from the unauthorized medical facility. Mitchell explained that Valerie had not just been administering standard psychiatric sedatives to keep my son docile. He pointed directly at Todd and stated that they had been systematically poisoning him. The judge quickly opened the red folder, his sharp eyes scanning the dense medical data. Mitchell did not give him time to question the private report. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a second sealed document, handing it to the court clerk to pass up to the bench. Mitchell proudly announced that this second document was a sworn affidavit from a senior medical examiner working directly for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal examiner had independently reviewed the blood samples and the initial toxicologist report. Mitchell summarized the terrifying findings for the permanent public record. The chemicals flowing through the veins of my son included a rare illegal synthetic neurotoxin, specifically engineered to violently degrade human neural pathways and mimic the late stages of severe degenerative brain disease. Mitchell raised his voice, letting the sheer horror of the crime wash over the paralyzed courtroom. He declared that Todd and Valerie were actively engaged in the slow, premeditated murder of my son, using a hospital room as their personal execution chamber. Todd completely lost his mind. The terrifying reality of the forensic blood evidence shattered whatever fragile composure he had left. He leaped up from his heavy wooden chair, knocking it completely over onto the floor. He pointed a shaking, sweaty finger across the courtroom, directly at Valerie, who was still being firmly held by the federal marshals by the doors. Todd began to scream frantically, throwing the woman he had hired completely under the bus in a desperate attempt to save himself. He yelled to the judge that he had absolutely no idea she was using lethal neurotoxins. He swore under oath that he only hired her to keep Derek mildly sedated so they could get the corporate paperwork finalized. He claimed that Valerie was a rogue, psychotic nurse who had taken the plan entirely too far on her own. He pleaded with the judge, his voice cracking with genuine terror, swearing that he only wanted to secure the business deal with the military and that he never wanted anyone to be murdered. It was the exact confession we had been eagerly waiting for. In his blind panic to avoid a murder charge, Todd had just publicly admitted to corporate fraud conspiracy and the intentional drugging of his business partner. The judge stared at Todd with a look of absolute icy contempt, lifting his pen to sign the federal arrest warrants right there on the high bench. But I needed Todd to know that it was not just the law that had caught him. I needed him to know that the old helpless man he tried to destroy was the exact architect of his absolute ruin. I placed my hand gently on the shoulder of my son, letting him know I had this handled, and I slowly walked forward. I stepped past Mitchell and approached the central microphone standing on the wooden podium. The entire courtroom fell dead silent as I looked directly into the terrified, weeping eyes of the man who had tried to steal my family. I did not yell or lose my temper. I spoke with the cold, measured precision of a man delivering a fatal blow. I told Todd that his cowardly attempt to blame his hired accomplice was both pathetic and entirely useless. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. I held them up for the judge and the entire court to see. I announced that these documents were certified decrypted ledgers tracing a labyrinth of dark web cryptocurrency wallets. I explained that while Todd was busy trying to convince the world I was a senile old fool, I had systematically dismantled his entire offshore financial network. I turned the pages, reading the undeniable proof out loud. I traced a single massive transfer of exactly $2 million originating from a private shell company solely owned by Todd. I read the destination account, proving the money landed directly in an offshore banking account registered to Valerie just 3 days before she began poisoning my son. I looked Todd dead in the eyes and told him the payment was not for medical care. It was the exact price of murder. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was finally broken by the sharp crack of the wooden gavel. The judge did not ask for any further explanations or offer the opposing counsel a chance to present a defense. He looked down from his elevated bench with an expression of absolute disgust and immediately issued severe bench warrants right there on the spot. He ordered the courtroom bailiffs to take Todd into direct custody without the possibility of bail. Todd collapsed back into his wooden chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, weeping openly as the bailiffs quickly approached and forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing around his wrists echoed perfectly alongside the muffled screams of Valerie still struggling by the doors. The wealthy tech executive who had arrogantly plotted to steal a $150 million algorithm was now a federal prisoner. But my work in that courtroom was not completely finished. The financial mastermind was in chains, and the black market nurse was secured, but the medical professional who had willingly provided the legal ammunition for their horrific conspiracy was still breathing free air. I turned my gaze away from Todd and looked directly past the wooden railing, scanning the back rows of the public gallery. Sitting discreetly near the far wall wearing a pristine beige suit and holding an expensive leather briefcase on his lap was Dr. Eris Thorne. He had attended the emergency hearing to personally testify to my supposed dementia and to legally validate the fake schizophrenia diagnosis of my son, fully expecting to collect the remaining balance of his massive corrupt fee. When my eyes locked onto his, the arrogant posture he held just moments ago vanished completely. Dr. Thorne slowly stood up, gripping his briefcase tightly, instinctively looking toward the side exit of the gallery. I stepped back up to the microphone and raised my voice, ensuring every single person in the courtroom focused their attention directly on the man attempting to slip away. I addressed the judge once again, stating that the criminal conspiracy to murder my son could never have reached this advanced stage without the deliberate, malicious participation of a licensed medical professional. I pointed my finger straight at Dr. Thorne. The judge narrowed his eyes, immediately recognizing the man whose signature was plastered all over the fraudulent medical declarations sitting on his bench. Dr. Thorne froze in his tracks. I pulled another folder from the heavy leather briefcase resting on the clerk desk and held it up high. I explained that this folder contained the meticulously hidden records of his highly exclusive rehabilitation clinic. I detailed how Mitchell had spent the entire night unearthing the sealed lawsuits and buried complaints from former patients who had been similarly drugged, manipulated, and robbed under the guise of luxury psychiatric care. I spoke clearly into the microphone, dissecting his medical career, piece by piece. I told the court that Dr. Thorne had deliberately diagnosed my son with early-onset schizophrenia without conducting a single legitimate psychiatric evaluation. I explained that he had signed the fake medical proxy, giving Valerie total control fully, knowing she was a former employee who specialized in chemical restraints. He had purposely authorized the use of a lethal synthetic neurotoxin under the disguise of heavy sedatives to ensure Derek would appear completely broken and legally incompetent. Furthermore, he had willingly signed the false Adult Protective Services report, claiming I had suffered a massive stroke, ensuring my financial assets were entirely frozen, so I could not legally interfere. Dr. Thorne had weaponized his medical license to facilitate a cold-blooded murder. He was not a healer. He was a highly paid corporate assassin wearing a white medical coat. Dr. Thorne finally panicked. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, the metal clasps popping open and spilling his pristine paperwork across the polished floor of the gallery. He turned toward the heavy wooden doors, desperate to escape the courtroom before the judge could issue another warrant. But just as he took his first frantic step, the side doors of the gallery swung open with tremendous force. 3 federal agents from the Department of Health and Human Services, fully coordinated by the prior late-night calls from Mitchell, strode aggressively into the room. They did not wear suits. They wore dark tactical jackets with large, bold letters across their chests. The lead agent pointed directly at the corrupt physician, loudly ordering him to halt and place his hands flat against the nearest wooden bench. Dr. Thorne raised his hands in immediate surrender, his face entirely devoid of color. The federal agents moved in swiftly, grabbing his wrists and securing them in tight steel cuffs. The lead agent read him his rights in a booming voice, officially charging him with massive federal healthcare fraud, the intentional falsification of legal medical records, and being a direct accessory to premeditated attempted murder. They forcefully marched him down the center aisle of the courtroom, parading him right past the plaintiff table, where Todd was still weeping in custody. The judge watched the entire procession, with a look of grim satisfaction, striking his gavel one more time to formally revoke every single medical credential attached to the name of Aris Thorne. I stood silently at the podium, feeling a profound wave of closure wash over my tired body. The entire corrupt network that had enabled this horrific abuse was now completely and systematically dismantled right in front of a completely stunned courtroom. The greedy business partner who wanted to steal an empire, the black market nurse who administered the poison, and the corrupt doctor who provided the legal shield were all in heavy steel chains. They had walked into this courtroom, expecting to easily bury a helpless son and his senile father. Instead, they had walked directly into a devastating, inescapable trap that stripped them of their wealth, their reputations, and their once completely untouchable freedom. The harsh click of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around the wrists of Todd echoed through the cavernous courtroom like the final strike of an executioner. The bailiffs yanked him roughly to his feet, pulling his arms high behind his back. The violent physical restraint shattered the last remaining fragments of his arrogant facade. Todd was no longer the polished, untouchable executive in the bespoke suit. He was a broken, pathetic criminal facing the total collapse of his existence. He twisted his upper body, ignoring the commands of the federal officers, and locked his tear-filled eyes onto the face of my son. He began to beg. It was a loud, hysterical, sobbing display of absolute cowardice. Todd cried out to Derek, his voice cracking with panic, pleading with him to remember the early days of their friendship. He brought up the freezing nights they spent coding in their cramped garage, the shared meals when they were entirely broke, and the grand dreams they had built together. He weaponized their shared history, begging Derek to tell the judge that this was a terrible mistake that could be resolved privately without destroying their entire company. Derek stood completely still next to our polished wooden table. He did not turn away, and he did not show a single ounce of pity. He looked down at the man who had ordered his slow, agonizing death with absolute, chilling apathy. There was zero emotion in the dark eyes of my son. The chemicals had stripped away his physical strength, but the betrayal permanently severed his capacity to care about the man crying before him. Derek did not shout, and he did not offer a dramatic speech about vengeance or justice. His profound silence was infinitely more devastating than any words he could have spoken. He stared at Todd as if he were looking at a stranger, an irrelevant obstacle that had finally been removed from his path. Todd continued to sob, his pleas becoming more frantic and incoherent as the bailiffs began to drag him backward toward the holding cell doors. He screamed that he was sorry, that the money had blinded him, that he would give up his entire stake in the artificial intelligence algorithm if Derek would just drop the federal charges. But Todd did not possess the leverage to negotiate anymore. Mitchell Gallagher stepped forward, resting his hands on the edge of the plaintiff table where Todd had sat so confidently just an hour ago. Mitchell pulled a single crisp white document from his heavy leather briefcase and laid it flat on the polished wood. He spoke loudly enough for the entire courtroom and the judge to hear. Mitchell explained that the original founding corporate charter of their software startup contained a specific ironclad morality and criminal breach clause. It explicitly stated that if any managing partner was found actively engaging in felony criminal acts against the company or its primary shareholders, their equity and executive voting rights could be immediately and unilaterally terminated without financial compensation. Mitchell looked directly at Todd, whose eyes were wide with a new, distinct terror. Mitchell stated that attempted murder and federal wire fraud certainly qualified as a terminal breach of contract. Mitchell handed a silver pen to my son. It was not a pen taped to his hand by a black market nurse. It was a pen offered with respect, returning total agency and control back to the rightful owner. Derek took the pen. His hand did not shake. He leaned over the polished wooden table and pressed the metal nib against the bottom of the legal document. With smooth, deliberate strokes, Derek signed his name. It was a perfect, confident signature, entirely unlike the jagged drug-induced forgery Todd had submitted to the military. The moment the dark ink dried on the white paper, the financial execution of Todd was absolute and irreversible. He did not just lose his executive position. He was completely stripped of his 50% stake in the $150 million defense contract. His stock options were voided. His corporate assets were seized. Derek legally severed him from the empire they had built, leaving Todd devastatingly financially ruined. He would face a massive federal criminal trial without corporate funds to hire a competent defense attorney. He was going to federal prison as a completely broken, penniless man. The realization of his total financial annihilation hit Todd harder than the criminal charges. A guttural, agonizing scream ripped from his throat. It was the raw sound of a greedy man watching his entire universe burn to ashes. He thrashed violently against the bailiffs, screaming the name of my son in pure desperation, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly across the polished courtroom floor. The judge banged his wooden gavel rapidly, ordering the officers to remove the hysterical prisoner from his courtroom immediately. The heavy wooden doors to the holding cells swung open, and Todd was forcefully dragged backward into the dark corridor, his echoing screams slowly fading away as the steel doors slammed shut behind him. I turned away from the closed doors and looked across the courtroom. Valerie was still pinned against the main exit by the two federal marshals. She watched the destruction of Todd in paralyzed silence. The arrogant smirk she wore during Sunday dinner was permanently erased. She did not scream or cry. She stared at the floor tiles with terrified eyes. The heavy reality of her situation crashed down upon her shoulders. Todd was broke and could not protect her. Dr. Thorne was in handcuffs and would testify against her to save himself. She was the very person who had physically administered the illegal synthetic neurotoxins. She had held my son captive. She was no longer looking at an easy escape. As the marshals read her the final list of federal conspiracy and attempted murder charges, Valerie realized she was staring at 25 years to life in a maximum security federal prison. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing the fates of the criminals who had tried to destroy us. The judge turned his full attention back to the high wooden bench, his expression transforming from absolute disgust to professional resolution. He picked up his wooden gavel and struck the block one final resounding time. With clear and deliberate enunciation, the judge legally dissolved the fraudulent medical power of attorney that had kept my son a prisoner in his own home. He ordered the immediate destruction of the fake medical proxy, formally restoring total bodily autonomy and legal independence to Derek. The nightmare of chemical restraints and forced compliance was officially over on the public record. Then the judge turned to the emergency financial injunctions. He signed a direct court order instructing Chase Bank to immediately unfreeze my $40 million private trust account, clearing my name of any fabricated mental incompetence or dementia accusations. We were fully restored. The legal web that Todd had so carefully spun was completely torn to shreds in a matter of hours. We thanked the judge for his swift execution of justice and turned to leave the silent courtroom. Walking down the long center aisle, I felt a profound weight lift from my shoulders. The heavy burden of fear, the terror of losing my only child to the dark greed of a trusted friend, evaporated. Derek walked beside me, his head held high, his steps growing more confident with every passing second. Mitchell Gallagher packed his heavy leather briefcase, clicking the brass locks shut with a satisfying snap. He joined us at the double doors, offering a rare, genuine smile of pure professional victory. We pushed through those doors and stepped out into the bustling marble corridors of the federal courthouse. But the chaos of the day was not entirely over. Word of the sudden dramatic arrest of a prominent Seattle tech executive inside a federal courtroom had spread like wildfire through the building. The moment we stepped out of the elevators and into the massive ground floor lobby, A blinding sea of flashing camera lights swallowed us. A massive swarm of local reporters, financial journalists, and television news crews had already gathered, blocking the main exit. They thrust heavy microphones and digital voice recorders aggressively toward our faces, shouting overlapping questions about the corporate fraud, the federal warrants, and the sudden collapse of the highly anticipated software acquisition. The noise was absolutely deafening, a chaotic storm of flashing bulbs and frantic voices demanding immediate answers. Derek faltered for a fraction of a second. The bright lights and sudden aggressive noise were overwhelming for a man who had spent the last 3 weeks locked in a dark room, chemically suppressed, and fighting for his life. His breathing hitched, and he instinctively took a small half-step backward. I did not let him fall. I immediately stepped completely in front of him, raising my broad shoulders to create a physical wall between my son and the ravenous press. I wrapped my right arm firmly around his shoulders, pulling him close to my side, shielding his face from the blinding camera flashes. I glared directly into the lenses of the television cameras, with the cold, unyielding authority of a father who had just torn a criminal empire completely down to its foundations. I did not offer a single comment. I did not give them a soundbite or headline. I used my physical presence to silently communicate a single undeniable truth to the entire world watching. My son was absolutely safe. Our family was completely unbreakable, and no amount of money could ever sever the protective bond between us. Mitchell and the 2 ex-military private contractors moved swiftly, forming a tight defensive wedge around us. They aggressively pushed through the dense crowd of reporters, carving a clear path toward the heavy revolving glass doors. We burst out into the cold, refreshing Seattle air, leaving the chaotic shouting of the press behind us. The unmarked black utility van was idling at the curb, the side door already sliding open to receive us. We climbed quickly inside the heavy door, slamming shut, and instantly muting the frantic noise of the outside world. The van accelerated smoothly away from the courthouse, merging seamlessly into the busy afternoon traffic. The quiet interior of the van felt like an absolute sanctuary. I let out a long, shuddering breath, finally, allowing the immense adrenaline of the morning to slowly drain from my veins. Derek leaned his head back against the dark leather seat, closing his eyes. A faint, genuine smile graced his lips for the first time in almost a month. He was completely free. We rode in comfortable, victorious silence for several miles, watching the tall glass skyscrapers of the city fade into the background. Then Mitchell cleared his throat softly from the seat directly across from us. He reached down and opened his heavy leather briefcase one final time. He did not pull out a legal brief or a court injunction. He pulled out a thick, pristine manila folder bearing the official embossed seal of the United States Department of Defense. It was the original uncorrupted asset transfer agreement, the highly classified contract that Todd had desperately tried to forge and steal. Mitchell handed a final folder directly to me. I gently passed it over to my son. The massive $150 million algorithm now rested securely in the hands of its creator. Mitchell looked at Derek and spoke in a deeply respectful tone. He told my son that with Todd legally removed from the corporate charter and his shares completely seized, Derek was now the sole owner and ultimate executive authority of the technology. The government buyers were still waiting on standby, entirely unaware of the dramatic courtroom bloodbath. Mitchell told him the choice was his. He had the absolute power to do whatever he wanted with the corporate empire he had built from the start. The ride back to my house in the quiet suburbs of Seattle was a stark contrast to the violence of the morning. By the time evening finally fell, a heavy, comforting rain had begun to slowly wash over the dark city, drumming softly against the large glass windows of my empty living room. I built a fire in the stone hearth, the warm orange light flickering across the room and chasing away the lingering shadows of the past month. Derek sat in the deep leather armchair opposite me, staring intently into the flames. Resting on his lap was the pristine manila folder containing the Department of Defense contract. $150 million in government funds representing the absolute pinnacle of corporate success. He traced the embossed seal with his thumb, completely silent for a long time. Then, with a sudden, quiet resolve, he opened the folder and pulled out the thick stack of papers. He did not ask for my permission, and he did not hesitate. Derek leaned forward and fed the first page directly into the burning fire. I watched as the crisp white paper curled and blackened the green flames, consuming the dark ink of the military agreement. He fed the rest of the contract into the hearth piece by piece until nothing remained but glowing gray ash. He looked up at me, the reflection of the fire dancing in his dark eyes, and told me that he was going to release the foundational code of his artificial intelligence algorithm to the public domain. He was making it open source. He explained to me that a sophisticated technology capable of perfectly predicting human movements and critical logistical vulnerabilities was simply too incredibly dangerous to be owned by a single military entity or a greedy corporate board. By giving it to the world for free, he was completely stripping it of its weaponized value. It was a beautiful, profound act of corporate rebellion. It cost him a massive personal fortune, and it meant starting completely over from scratch. But looking at his face, I had never been more incredibly proud of him. But as the final embers of the military contract faded into the ash, the adrenaline that had sustained Derek through the courtroom battle finally ran out. The heavy emotional toll of his captivity crashed down upon him all at once. His shoulders slumped forward, and he buried his face in his hands. A low, agonizing sob tore through his chest. It was the first time he had truly cried since the nightmare began. He wept with the raw, unfiltered pain of a man who had been completely violated in his own home. Between his heavy, ragged breaths, he began to apologize to me. He apologized for being so foolishly blind to the manipulative tactics of Valerie. He cursed himself for letting a complete stranger isolate him from his family, for not seeing the poison she was pouring into his cup. He looked at me, his face streaked with tears, and called himself weak. He said he should have fought harder when Todd first suggested the corporate buyout, that he should have seen the betrayal coming from his oldest friend. He wept because he felt he had failed me, that he had dragged his elderly father into a deadly crossfire, because he was not strong enough to protect his own life. He believed he had almost lost everything. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, walked across the warm rug, and knelt directly in front of my exhausted son. I reached out and gripped his trembling shoulders with both of my hands, forcing him to look up and meet my eyes. I spoke to him with a gentle, unwavering firmness, making sure every single word sank deep into his healing mind. I told him to never apologize for trusting people. I explained that Todd and Valerie were professional predators, individuals who had entirely abandoned their humanity in exchange for money. They had weaponized his kindness, his dedication, and his love. I told Derek that true weakness is allowing the darkness of the world to turn your heart cold and bitter. I reminded him of the 4 frantic squeezes he gave my hand under the dining room table while his brain was clouded with toxic chemicals. I told him that fighting for survival when your mind and body are being actively destroyed is the absolute definition of human strength. He did not surrender to the poison, and he did not surrender his morals to the greed of his partner. He survived the deepest darkness imaginable, and instead of seeking a violent revenge, he had just chosen to give his life work away to protect others. I pulled him into a tight embrace, resting my chin on his shoulder, holding him just as I did when he was a frightened little boy, waking up from a nightmare. I told him he was the strongest man I had ever known. He held on to me tightly, his sobbing slowly subsiding into quiet, rhythmic breathing as the warmth of the fire filled the quiet room. I stayed kneeling there for a very long time, quietly listening to the heavy rain against the glass, and I allowed my mind to slowly drift back through the long chapters of my life. I thought about my late wife, how fiercely she had loved our only son, and how incredibly proud she would be today. For decades, I had mistakenly believed that my corporate empire was my greatest legacy. I thought the massive amounts of money sitting in my private accounts was the ultimate measure of success. But holding my son in the quiet aftermath of our survival, I finally understood the truth. All the wealth in the world meant absolutely nothing if you did not have family. My greatest achievement was raising a son who fought to survive, chose kindness over wealth, and still knew how to ask his loving father for help. Exactly 1 week later, the heavy Seattle rain had finally cleared, leaving behind a crisp, cool Sunday evening. I stood in my kitchen, the same custom kitchen where this entire nightmare had begun, and flipped 2 thick cuts of steak on the cast-iron skillet. The rich, savory aroma of searing meat filled the warm air of the house. There were no fake, polished girlfriends sitting at my dining room table pouring expensive red wine. There were no greedy business partners lurking in the shadows, waiting to steal a lifetime of hard work. The house was wonderfully, profoundly quiet. It was the kind of deep, comforting silence that you only truly appreciate after you have survived a deafening storm. I transferred the perfectly cooked steaks onto 2 porcelain plates and carried them into the dining room. Derek was already sitting there pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water. The transformation in him over the past 7 days was nothing short of miraculous. The ghostly hollow pallor that had haunted his face was completely gone. His skin had regained its natural healthy color, and his dark eyes were bright, sharp, and entirely present. He was no longer the broken, heavily medicated hostage I had seen strapped to that bare mattress. He was my son again, strong and resilient. We sat down across from each other, unfolding our clean linen napkins. There were no hidden messages smeared in steak sauce tonight. There was only the simple, sacred act of sharing a meal together in absolute safety. As we ate in comfortable, peaceful silence, I looked at the young man sitting across from me and felt a profound sense of gratitude. If you are still listening to my story, I want you to remember the lessons we learned the hard way. The world can be an incredibly dangerous place, and the most terrifying monsters do not hide in the dark alleys or break through your windows in the middle of the night. Sometimes the most dangerous predators walk right through your front door wearing tailored suits and perfect sympathetic smiles. They camouflage themselves as devoted friends, brilliant business partners, or loving companions. They use your own kindness and your own trust as weapons against you. They rely on the polite boundaries of society, betting that you will be too polite to question their motives or too busy to notice the subtle changes in the people you love. You must never stop paying attention to your family. You must look past the surface and watch for the silent alarms. When the people you love suddenly change, when they become distant, confused, or isolated, do not simply accept the convenient explanations offered by the new people in their life. Trust your gut. If your instincts are screaming that something is wrong, you must act. An unbreakable code of family means protecting each other when words fail. It means fighting for them when they are too weak to fight for themselves. True wealth is not measured by the size of your trust fund or the value of your corporate contracts. True wealth is having people in your life who will walk through absolute hell to bring you back into the light. Todd and Valerie believed they could easily dismantle our family because they worshipped money, and they assumed we were just as isolated and selfish as they were. They severely underestimated the devastating power of a father who simply refused to let go of his son. We finished our meal as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow through the dining room windows. The atmosphere was triumphant, not because we had preserved a financial empire, but because we had preserved our souls. Derek pushed his empty plate forward and leaned back in his wooden chair. He did not look terrified or exhausted. He looked completely at peace. Then he did something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. He did not drop his hand into the dark shadows beneath the heavy oak table. He did not need to hide his actions or beg for a secret rescue anymore. Derek casually reached his right hand straight across the top of the polished wooden table right into the warm light. He rested his hand gently on top of mine. He did not squeeze 4 times in a frantic panic. He looked me directly in the eyes, his expression full of profound love and unwavering confidence, and he squeezed my hand exactly one time. A single firm squeeze. It was a new code. It did not mean he needed to be saved. It simply meant thank you. I smiled back at him, turning my hand over to warmly return the gentle grasp. The dark clouds that had gathered over our lives had finally broken. The corporate thieves were locked away in federal prison cells, their greedy ambitions permanently crushed. The poison was completely out of his system, and the heavy burden of the military weapon was gone from his conscience. We were just two men sitting in a quiet house ready to start the next chapter of our lives, with a clean slate and an unbreakable bond. The long, terrifying nightmare was finally over. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you to hold your loved ones a little closer and watch over them a little more carefully, please hit the like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more true life stories of survival, justice, and family. Tell me in the comments below what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Would you have driven your car into that brick mailbox to save your child? Let us meet in the comments section. Until next time, stay vigilant. Trust your instincts and always protect the people you love.